Hey guys, and welcome back to a new video. In this video, I will lead you through how we can use Android's Credential Manager in order to improve our username password authentication we might already have in the app by taking these credentials and saving them in Google's Credential Manager. Because what this will allow us to do is not only that future logins will be easier since these credentials will be saved and users will be able to see a dialog which they can then take and just accept that they want to log in with these already saved credentials. But since these credentials are saved in your user's Google account, they will also be able to use these credentials across devices and possibly even on your website if you have a website and an app version of that. So they can always just use those saved credentials without having to relog in. So to show you what we will build here is we'll build a little sign up and sign in form at once. So we can enter a username and a password we want to then register with. After registering, you will see if we do this, then this pop-up will show that we can save these new credentials here in Credential Manager. You can see the password will also show up there if you want that. If we then hit continue, then we save this. We do automatically get to our signed in screen. So that is the screen where users would get to after successfully logging in. But if we now close this app, relaunch it, so we would have to relog in, then we will get back on our login screen. Let's try to log in with some invalid credentials, user 1 and pass. We log in. Then you can see, regardless of what we enter here, our Credential Manager pop-up will show up. Since it recognized that we already have saved credentials, we can then pick these, click continue, and we will be signed in with our saved credentials. And we again land on the signed in screen, regardless of what we entered before. And we could, of course, also set it up in a way that we show this Credential Manager pop-up before explicitly clicking login, which would probably be the better UX here. So in general, before we can get started, what you need to understand is that there are two main ways how we can use the Credential Manager in order to authenticate users. On the one hand, what I've just showed you with the username password authentication, but another one is also by using so-called passkeys. So with this passkey authentication, what we can achieve is that we can also make use of this Credential Manager, but pretty much let users sign in with a single tap. So they don't explicitly need to enter their password and username, but they could also authenticate directly, for example, with their fingerprint authentication. And this would then also work across devices and even on your app's website if you have that. But setting up that is a bit more complex. That would also require us to set up a little backend here with a login system to really show you every aspect of that, which is why I opted for this username password authentication, which most of the websites out there and most of the apps out there will probably have. But if you say passkeys is definitely something you need in your app, then please let me know that down below. But only if you'd really also watch such a video, since making these is actually quite time consuming, as you can guess. All right, the first thing you need to do in order to follow through this video is you need to clone the initial branch that I've linked down below from my GitHub, because that already includes all the necessary dependencies we are going to need for this video. So specifically, those are the Android X Credentials core dependency, which contains the Credential Manager set up for, I think, Android 14 plus. Yes, you can see the other one is optional, but if you want to support Android versions below 14, so for Android 13 and below, then you also need this compat dependency. Otherwise, your app would crash if you don't catch that otherwise, and you certainly wouldn't be able to use Credential Manager. We have the typical lifecycle runtime compose dependency in order to construct view models, and we use Navigation Compose together with the Kotlin X serialization, so the new type safe navigation and compose, in order to create our little two-screen setup. And I just noticed that I'm using the Kotlin serialization Gradle plugin, which I apparently haven't applied. So let's quickly fix that by putting this in here in our build.gradle app. So plugins, JetBrains, Kotlin serialization. And if we also take a look here in our build.gradle app file, scrolling down, then you can see I already added all those dependencies here in our dependencies block. Let's hit sync. And other than that, we can get started. I want to open the root structure of our project. And the first thing I want to create is already the heart of our app when it comes to Credential Manager. And that is a class that I want to call Account Manager. So this class will, on the one hand, manage creating credentials in Credential Manager. So when we sign up, so when we create a new account, then we want to prompt the user to also save these newly set up credentials in Google's Credential Manager. On the other hand, we also want this account manager to have a function to log in with existing credentials. So let's create that. Yes, let me add that to Git. And this account manager will need a constructor where we pass in an activity reference, since we need this activity reference in order to show this prompt with our Credential Manager, obviously. So this can just be any type of activity. In here, we can then use this activity context to retrieve our Credential Manager instance. So, well, Credential manager is equal to credential manager from here Android X credentials, and then we call that create with our activity context. And then below, we can have a suspend function, since that is how this will work, a function that will suspend for as long as that credential dialog is showing. We have a suspend function called sign up, which we have to call with our chosen username and our chosen password. And this will have to return some kind of result. So either if signing up with these credentials was successful, if it failed, or if this dialog was, for example, cancelled, since the user clicked somewhere else and canceled the dialog. For that, I would like to create a little sealed class in here. So let's make this a sign up result, for example, a sealed interface actually, with a few options. On the one hand, a data class called success. So if we successfully signed up in a credential manager, we pass in our username instance. So we get that back in the UI, and this can be a sign up result. We want a data object for when the sign up was canceled. So when the user closed the dialog. And we want a data object for when there was a failure. You could, of course, also make this a data class if you want to pass the explicit error message that the credential manager returned. But for now, let's just say there was some kind of failure. In here, this will then return a sign-up result. And we can dive into this function. And this is actually pretty easy, because all we want to do is we want to return a try and catch block. Since this whole credential manager API is heavily reliant on exceptions in case of errors, and we want to catch these. So on the one hand, an exception could be a credential, what is it called? Create credential cancellation exception, which will be called when, or which will be thrown when the credential prompt was cancelled. So in that case, we might want to print this, and we also want to return a sign-up result that cancelled. If it is just a normal credential exception, then create credential exception, create credential exception. So in all other cases, if it's not specifically a cancellation exception, we want to also catch these here, maybe print their stack trace. And we could then say sign up result.failure. And if you would want to pass the error message, then as I said, you can make this a data class and then pass something like e.errorMessage to get the actual error message in your UI. But the magic now happens here inside of this try block, because what we want to do is we want to use our credential manager, call create credential, this one here, this normal create credential function, which will take in a context, which we can just pass our activity for, and it will take a create credential request. And in our case, we just want to make this a create password request. There's also a create public key, what is it? Up here, create public key credential request that is used if you want to set up this passkey authentication that I talked about. Users can then log in with a fingerprint, for example, but we want password authentication here, or password credentials. So we say create password request, where we pass in an ID. So this would be the username in this case, or an email address, some kind of identifier of that user, which is not a secret. So here we can pass in the username, and we can pass in the password, which is our password, and that is obviously secret. And if this function, which is suspending, as you can see, if this finished without throwing an exception, then we know that saving these credentials was successful. So we can say we return sign-up result.success with the username being equal to our username we passed. I would say we now set up the UI in order to also let us sign up with these results, of course, so that we can already test this. And if that works, we can then extend this class with a login logic to really take these saved credentials and also log in with these. So let's go here to our root package, create something like a navigation root or so. So just a simple composable in which we put our two screens in this app. So we have a composable navigation root where we have our nav controller reference in there, which we can get with remember nav controller. Remember nav controller, have our nav host, pass in that nav controller, and we don't want to pass a graph, but rather start destination, which we can create with a new type safe compose navigation. So we need to create serializable objects in order to make this work. So that will be on the one hand, a data object for our login route. Yeah, let's call it login route. Make that a Kotlin Act serializable. And we will have a data class for our logged in route. So that will be the screen where we get after successfully logging in. And here we want to pass the username. So we can display it there like, hello, what kind of username we chose. That will also be a serializable. The start route will obviously be our login route. So that will be the first one. And in here, we can then have the definitions for how our screens should look like. We can define these with composable blocks. We say, okay, our login route should actually look like this. And our logged in route should look like this, where we can then get a reference to the past username by saying, well, username is equal to it, so our nav backstack entry, which contains our arguments, dot to route, and we convert that to a logged in route and refer to the username. I think here we could just put the screen's content in there, since that really won't be a lot. We can just have a modifier where we say, okay, we fill the whole size of our screen. Yeah, that should be it. Give it some content alignment of center. And in here, we just display text with hello username or so. In order to set up our login screen, let's just put this in a separate package so we bundle things a bit better, since there are several classes involved for this login screen. So let's have a login package. In that package, we create, on the one hand, a login state, which keeps the UI state for that screen. So simple data class where we store the logged in user, which will be the username of the logged in user, which can be null and will be null initially. We want to store the username, so the text field value, which is initially we will just enter our username so that we don't need to enter anything on our own. Feel free to change that, of course. We do have an initial password. We have an optional error message, which is a nullable string and null by default. And lastly, we have a Boolean whether we are currently in register or login mode. So is register, initially that's false. So initially we say we are in login mode. Then the next class we need, or interface rather, for our login screen is called login action. So this is the typical intent part of the MVI design pattern. So it's simply a steel interface which bundles all those user actions a user could do on the screen, like in this case, toggling the register mode, entering a password, entering username, clicking sign in, and so on. So here we just bundle all these in a sealed interface. So on the one hand, we need a data class on sign up, which is an action we will send when we click on sign up, where we are able to pass in a sign up result. So this will be a login action. We do need a data class for when the username changes, on username change. Passing in the new username. So whenever we type something in our text field, this is the action we'll fire. We want to have one when the password changes with a new password. And for now, we need a data object to toggle the register mode. So on is register. Let's call it on toggle is register. This does not need any constructor, and we will then later extend this with an on sign in function as well, or action. But for now, we only implemented signing up. So then in our login package, let's quickly create our login screen, which will be a composable called login screen. And that will receive, on the one hand, the login state we've created, as well as an on action lambda, which gives us a login action. So we can bubble that up to the nav host to finally delegate to the view model we don't yet have. All right, what do we need in this login screen? On the one hand, we need access to a coroutine scope. We can get with remember coroutine scope, since we will need to execute the function from our account manager here in a suspend function, in a coroutine, obviously. So we need a scope for that. We do need access to the context, which you can get with a local context at current. We do certainly need access to our account manager, which you can create with remember, and initializing this account manager reference in here. To pass the activity inside of a composable, we can use this context and convert it to a component activity, or just to think to an activity should also do it. Let's do component activity to be a bit more specific. And here I actually intentionally use this account manager in the UI itself and not in the view model, because this account manager contains an activity reference, which you have to be very careful with if you use that in a view model, since the activity has a different life cycle than your view model. The view model lives longer as the activity, which can very quickly lead to memory leaks if you have a configuration change. So if the user rotates the device, for example, which would destroy the previous activity reference. But if your view model, which outlives that lifecycle, still has a reference to that previously used activity reference, which is now destroyed, then the JVM garbage collector won't clean up that memory, and you will keep that old activity reference you can't do anything with anymore, and that's called a memory leak. So if you're using an object that holds an activity context, then you should really only use that in a context which does not outlive this lifecycle. And since this composable here does certainly not outlive the lifecycle of our activity, this is completely safe here. All right, in here, we're going to create a column. So we just want to have our few text fields here. So a column with text field 1, text field 2, a row with a switch, and finally a button. So that's pretty simple. Column can have a modifier of fill max size. We can give it some padding of 16 dp, Alt Enter to import that. And we can say we want to vertically center everything inside of that column. In here, we will then have a text field, where we pass in our state.username for the value. When the value changes, we can trigger our onAction lambda with onUsername change, passing in the new value. We can give this a label of username, and we can also pass in a modifier to make it stretch the whole width. Fill max width. We could also get a consistent spacing between all these items, composables in our column by using arrangement spaced by. We want to have, let's say, 16 dp of spacing, and then we can say we still want to align this vertically, center this vertically here in our column. So then we don't need to have spaces between every of these items. We want to have another text field, which will be for the password. We want to trigger on password change. The label can obviously also be a password label. Next up, we have the row for our text register and our switch. So let's say we have a row in which we have a text that says register. Here we can add a bit of horizontal spacing, so a spacer with a width of 8 dp, for example. And then we can have our switch where the isChecked value is equal to our state is register. So when we are in the register mode, then the switch should be checked, as you can see, and otherwise it should be unchecked. If we change this, then we want to trigger our onAction with onToggle is register. So we can then toggle the state in our view model. And lastly, after this row, we want to have our button to trigger signing up or signing in. So button, when we click this button, we trigger onAction. Well, not actually like that. Let's first of all put the text here, which is dependent on whether we are in register mode or not. If we are, then the text will be register, and otherwise login. But when we now click this button, then something should of course happen. We want to register or log in and then also save or use existing credentials. So now it's the time to make use of our account manager by saying account manager sign up, where the username is the username of our state. And the password is obviously also coming from that state. Since, as I said, that is a suspending function, so we need to execute this in a coroutine scope, which is why we created this scope reference initially. So in here, we can safely execute that now. So now we want to have a check that we only execute this call if we are actually in register mode. So we can move this in there, and we do get our sign up result here, which holds the information whether there was a failure, whether the request was canceled, whether it was successful, of course. And we can then take this and delegate handling that to our review model. So we call our onAction lambda, we say on sign up, and we pass in our sign up result. So the last thing that's now missing in order to test this, at least signing up, but signing in is then also not that much more extra logic. In order to test this, we need a view model. So our login view model, which is able to update our state. So here in our login package, let's have a login view model. This will also be quite simple. So just a login view model, actually normal view model, of course. Normal view model, not a view. In here, we will have a compose state reference. So var state by mutable state of, which will be a login state initially. Alt enter twice to import this. We can make this a private set, so only the view model is able to mutate that state, which is a practice that should always be followed. And then we need our onAction function, which is then finally able to handle all these bubbled up events in our UI. So here we do pass in our login action, which you can then handle in our big when expression. So we can again hit Alt Enter to add the remaining branches. When the password changes, that's easy. We just need to update our state with a new password. So state is equal to state.copy. And we set the password to the new password, which was attached to our action. Same thing for our username change. Here we want to update this with the username, and we want to update the username field. When the register boolean toggles, we can also easily update the state by saying is register is equal to is register negated. And then lastly, we can go here in on sign up to take the result here. So the sign up result, which was this seal interface. So it could be a successful result. It could be a cancelled or failed result. And we now want to check for that and just update our error message accordingly. So we can take this, check in a when expression what that result was, Alt-Enter to add the remaining branches. If it was cancelled, we say state.copy, and we update the error message to sign up was cancelled. If there was a failure, we say, okay, the sign up failed. And if that was successful, then we want to update our logged in user instead. So we say logged in user is equal to the result.username that we attach to our action. And that should already be it to handle sign up requests. So we can test this by going to our navigation route. Here in our login route, we can initialize our view model, set this to a view model of type login view model, get the state from that. We can actually do this inline. So we can call our login screen with our view model.state. And instead of having a trailing lambda here, I prefer to have this as a name parameter where we delegate all on action calls to our view model. If we then take our navigation route and finally call that here in main activity in our scaffold, let's also put this in a surface. So navigation route, and we do pass in our inner padding here to the surface, modifier, padding, inner padding. So we consider all these spacings from our status bar and so on, then we should be able to try this out. Let's launch this. And it's actually important that you can only try this out on a device where you're actually logged in with a Google account. So if you try this out on an emulator, you will first of all have to link your Google account, because otherwise there won't be any account you can save your credentials in. All right, we do have our username here where we can enter some kind of custom username. That works. We do have our password. We can enter something. We can switch the register boolean, as you can see. And if we are in register mode and we hit register, then we do see our credential manager pop up with our just created credentials. If we hit continue, then so far nothing happens because we did not yet implement the logic to get to the next screen when the login was successful. So let's now see how we can implement the rest of the app so we have a full sign in and sign up system with Credential Manager. For that, we want to, where do we want to go? In Account Manager. Let's hop into Account Manager and have a similar function to also sign in. So if we have existing credentials, this will be the function we will call instead. And here we now don't need to pass our username and a password, because what the sign up function will do is it will look internally in Google Credential Manager if there is already a saved credential, because that's the whole point of what we're doing here. We want to check if there are saved credentials so the user does not need to type these on their own. And similar to what we had here with the sign up result, we also want to have a sign in result. Will be very similar, just with one difference. So if we copy paste this class, make it the sign in result, then the only additional case that we have here is that if there are no credentials. So if we are trying to sign in, but there are no saved credentials in Credential Manager, we want to catch that with a data object, no credentials. Just one specific error I would like to catch here, so we can also show you how that works. So here, that'll return sign in result this time. We again return a try and catch block, try and catch, where we catch this time a get credential cancellation exception. So while up here it was for creating credentials, down here it's now for getting credentials. Since we are retrieving existing credentials, we can check for no credential exception. And lastly, for general get credential exceptions. Here we can also print all these and map these to sign in result dot failure. Here we can print this and say sign in result, no credentials. And here we can say e.print stack trace sign in result dot cancelled. And here we do get an error. Seems like I forgot. I actually made it sign up result. Let's swap this out with sign in result, of course, and then the error goes away. In this try block, we now get our credential response with our credential manager, and we call that get credential. So now we want to look for an existing credential that we've previously saved with the sign up function. We again pass in our activity context, and the get credential request is a new get credential request, with the credential options being equal to a list of get password option. So since there are multiple different types of credentials, as I said, so passkey credentials, password credentials, we could possibly call, or we could possibly retrieve multiple of these here, which is why this takes a list. We now just say, okay, we are looking to get existing credentials based on this request, where we say, these are the types of credentials we're looking for. And specifically in our case, we're looking for password credentials. Then from that credential response, we can get the username of that retrieved credential if it exists. So if that does not exist for some reason, we can also return here, return, in this case, sign in result dot failure, because if the credentials itself don't exist, it will already throw this exception, so the code won't even reach this point. So if this is null for some reason, then there will be some sort of failure. And then afterwards, we can return a sign-in result, success, with credential response dot credential. It's actually a bit different. Sorry, we can't yet return here, but rather we first need the actual credential, which we can parse from this. So val credential, which we can get from credential response, credential, and we cast that as a password credential, because that way we can also get a reference to the actual username and password combination. And if that thing does not exist, then we can return here. So return sign in result that failure. And now everything that follows afterwards, we know we have a valid retrieved password credential. And here in our simple use case, we would just take this credential, take the ID, so our username, and pass it and return it as a success case. What you would, of course, need to do now in your real app, if the user wants to proceed with this saved credential, you would, of course, need to make an API call to your API to log in with these credentials. So Google Credential Manager can, of course, not log in for you. It can just give you the already saved credentials, which you can then take in your app, make the login API call here with these credentials, so with credential.id and credential.password. So you really just treat everything from this point on here as if the user would normally and manually log in with entered username and password combination. So you can't yet assume that the login was successful at this point, because it could be that the user changed the password on the website or so, and that's something Google Credential Manager can't, of course, know unless the user also saved this in Google Credential Manager. So you will need to make an API call here to your backend, which tells your app, hey, login was successful, the credentials matched, or not. But in our case, we don't have a backend, so we just return the credentials, and we assume that this is a valid username password combination. Then in our login action, we want to extend this with an onSign-in function as well. OnSign-in, where the result is in this case a sign-in result. So we can also handle this in our view model, login view model. Let's copy this, since it's very similar to the login action on sign-in. So we can also handle these state changes there. When the action result is sign-in result.cancelled, or sign-in result.failure, or sign-in result.success, then here we want to say sign-in was cancelled, sign-in failed. If it's successful, we also update our logged-in user. And the last case we have is sign-in result, no credentials. Because in that case, we want to update our state with no credentials were set up. And then back in our login screen, what we can do is, up here, we can have a launched effect block with a key of true. So that block will immediately fire when our screen appears. And in here, what we want to do is we want to fire the request that checks if there is already valid credentials. Because when our login screen shows, we want to check, okay, are there valid credentials? And if so, we want to ask the user if they want to log in with it. So we say val result is equal to account manager dot sign in this time. And if that was successful, so wasn't cancelled in between, then we call on action with on sign in. And we do pass in our result here, so this will be handled by our view model. Another launched effect block we might want to use here is one that listens to the logged in user updates. So whenever that changes, then we want to check if our logged in user is not null. And if it isn't, then we call on action. Let's actually create a separate lambda for that that will be called when we successfully logged in. So on logged in, for example, with our username that we pass to the lambda. And if the user was not null at this point when it changed, then we call this with state logged in user. and actually the onlogged in Lambda. So the flow is this: we initially check if there is valid credential. We take the result of that, wrap it in this result. We take this result, send it to our view model, so the view model can handle this. Here in this when expression, it will update the error message if there was some kind of error, which we, by the way, have to still display in the UI. But if the sign-in was successful, then we'll update the logged-in user instance with this username. This will again trigger the launch effect log here, since the logged-in user changed. And if it's not null, we call onlogged-in, where we will then perform the navigation one level above. Let's quickly also add this text below this row to show the error message. So if the, let's use an if statement. If state that error message is not null, so if there is some kind of error message, we can show a text with that error message. We can give it the color of material theme, color scheme, error, and I think that should be it. That will be enough to display the error. Feel free to format that in any way you prefer. Now we need to hop one level above in our navigation route, because here we do get an error, since we need to use this onlogged in Lambda. In this case, we now want to take the nav controller, call navigate, since we want to navigate to our logged in screen, logged in route. And here we need to pass the username, which is just it. So that comes from this Lambda reference. And we might also want to say set or pop up to with a specific route. So our login route, and we set this to inclusive equal to true. So what this will do is it will navigate to the new logged in route and pop all the screens up to the login route, which is inclusive, so we can't navigate back to the login screen, which is usually behavior you want for such sign-in flows. All right, I think this should be ready to try out. So if everything works successfully, then the moment we now relaunch this app, we should get this immediate prompt from Account Manager that we can log in with our credentials. Let's do that. Yep, there we go. And yes, there is our immediate prompt to log in with these existing credentials. If we hit continue, we are signing in, and we do see hello username on our second screen. That is very cool. One thing I am curious about is if we can somehow reset this. So if we do this, and we do get the error message that this sign-in was cancelled. But I'm curious if we delete this app, if we can then test the sign-up logic again, so that we automatically get to the logged in screen. So I now uninstalled the app and relaunched it. But as you can see, that's actually the purpose of why we're using Credential Manager. So even across app installs, these credentials are now saved, and we are prompted to use it to log in. But I think we can cancel this, go inside of register mode, maybe register with other credentials, click register. Yes, then we can save these other credentials. Let's continue. And then we do log in with the other account. And if we go back, then yes, our app is closed since we popped the login route from the backstack. One important thing that I have to mention at the end here is if you want to now link this with your website. So if you're building, let's imagine the YouTube app, where YouTube certainly has a website and an app, and in both of these, users can log in with the same account. So if you have a similar setup with a website and an app, and you want to share these logins with Google Credential Manager, you need to, of course, somehow tell your app that your website is linked to it. And the way this works is with a so-called digital assets JSON file. So here in the official Android docs, sign in your user with Credential Manager. You need to go to this Add Support for Digital Asset Links section, where you need to take such a JSON file that you set up, called assetlinks.json, where you replace your package name with the actual package name of your app, or you pass in your SHA 256 fingerprint. So the fingerprint hash value of your app you can generate with Gradle. And then you take this JSON file and you have to upload it to this path. So to your website /wellknown/assetlinks.json. So this is the path where Google will then look for existing apps. So when a user visits your website on an Android device, then Google will fetch this JSON file. And if it can find your Android app that is installed on that user's device in that AssetLinks JSON file, and the fingerprint also matches, then users will also be able to get that Credential Manager prompt on your website if they've previously set that up with your app. Or just the other way around, of course, if they set that up with the website and they then install the app, then they will also get the prompt in the app. But this is just something that is quite difficult to show for a tutorial, since I would need to set up a completely new website with a login flow and so on, which is why I decided to show you the core of this API. And depending on your use case, then of course, feel free to adjust this. I hope this really helped you to save credentials in your app. As usual, down below, you will find a link with more advanced Android premium courses. So if you're enjoying these videos and you feel like, okay, there is more to learn, I really want to become an industry-ready Android developer, then check out these courses, because they are all really meant to teach you these skills of Android development that are really relevant for the actual job life, where we don't waste time on any unimportant details. Other than that, thanks so much for watching this video. I will see you back in the next one. Have an amazing rest of your week. Bye-bye.